It all began one day when my wife and I went to Orkney on honeymoon, and we were very, very lucky in that the day that we went to visit the chapel, we had the building to ourselves. And the building is unmanned, so there was literally nobody else there. So we put our money in the box at the front door, and we each picked up the little booklet that gives a brief history of how the chapel came into being. And we were reading these booklets as we were walking slowly down the nave, and we caught up again together at the beautiful rood screen, and we stood for quite a while looking into the chancel, and I had quite a moist eye. And when I looked over at Catherine, tears were streaming down her face, and I thought, this is absolutely extraordinary. How can a Second World War Nissen hut converted with scrap material affect us so much that we are moved to tears? And before we'd even left the building, I had decided two things. I had decided I was going to research as much as I possibly could into the events surrounding the chapel's creation, and that I was going to write a film script about this, because it just said film to me, and I couldn't believe that a film had never been made. And so that was the goal I set myself.
Before I come to the historic story of the chapel, how do you explain this emotional, spiritual impact on you and your wife?
It's a difficult one to put into words. I say in the book, the men had put so much of themselves into the chapel during a period for them of great hardness. I mean, they were working in terrible conditions, both in terms of the weather and the working conditions on the barriers. And they created out of scrap material something which, yes, it is beautiful, but it's much more than that. It's, I think, a spirituality that crosses all boundaries of nationality, religion and beliefs. And that's really what touched us. And it's something, I've been in a few cathedrals in Europe over the years, and I've never been moved to tears by them.
Let's go back to the beginning of this remarkable story of Orkney's Italian chapel. 14th of October 1939, the sinking of HMS Royal Oak at Scapa Flow. That's where it all started, isn't it?
It is in many ways. Scapa Flow, which is 120 square miles of sea encased by Orkney Islands, was used as the harbour for the British Home Fleet, and it was reckoned to be a safe haven for them. But on that night, that was the 13th of October, a U-boat entered the sanctuary over the harbour and sank HMS Royal Oak with huge loss of life. 833 men died. The ship went down in less than 15 minutes.
Wow.
And the U-boat escaped back to Germany. And Winston Churchill ordered that these eastern entrances into Scapa Flow should be sealed permanently by huge barriers.
As I understand this, because of the natural archipelago of islands around Orkney, Scapa Flow was a natural, should have been,
yes,
a natural safe haven for
yes,
the Royal Fleet.
Yes, and it had been used for the exact same purpose in the First World War. It gave access, easy access to both the North Sea and the Atlantic, but it was proved not to be as safe as they thought. And so the task began of building these huge barriers, which was started by Balfour Beatty, but they began to run out of men because they were in short supply. However, in North Africa, the British Army held tens of thousands of Italian prisoners of war who were captured during the North African campaigns. And so during the summer of 41, around 1,200 men were chosen from a camp in Egypt, and they were put in hold of a ship. They were kept there pretty much for the whole of the journey, apart from a few stops, and eventually they ended up in the middle of winter at the beginning of 1942 on this, on two islands in Orkney.
Can you imagine, for these Italian POWs, I'm sure you can, the incredible contrast from the heat of Africa to the ravages of Orkney?
Yes, it must have seemed like they'd gone to an alien planet. It was the opposite to everything they knew, and it wasn't just the weather. It was strange food. They were in a prisoner of war camp. They were a long way from their loved ones, who obviously they were very worried about. Some men fell ill with psychological problems just because of the strain of it. And it wasn't very long after they arrived that they actually went on strike, which is not something to be undertaken lightly when you're a prisoner of war, but it showed how much they were just affected by the harshness of everything.
And among this incoming group of Italian POWs that came from Africa to Orkney was an artist, Domenico Chiocchetti, and then maybe a year later, roughly, a Padre Giacomo.
Yeah.
These two men you describe in your book were significant figures in the building of the chapel.
Yes, yes, absolutely. There were several artists in the camp, very skilled men, but they had no priest. And it wasn't until the arrival of Padre Giacomo, which was in September of 1943, that the idea of building a chapel became a reality. And they were very fortunate in that the British camp commander, Major Buckland, was very enthusiastic about the welfare of the Italians in his charge and readily agreed to help these men source, as it was, 2 Nissen huts which were moved to the camp, and that gave them the structure which they then converted over the following months.
How long did it take to construct the chapel, and can you describe to me what the working conditions were for the builders, for the POWs?
The main tasks of the men were to build these great causeways, which a lot of people locally said were impossible to build. Obviously, you had a flow of water going in one direction several hours of the day, and then later on it was going in the other direction. So it presented huge problems for the construction workers. But mainly they were building concrete blocks to drop into the sea, filling great wire nets with stones to drop into the sea. So they were working in the blockyards as well as in the quarry, and they were constantly repairing railway track which was torn up by the rough seas. But the men who were the key artists, and I think it just shows how much Major Buckland was enthusiastic to help them, the men who were actually the key artists were allowed to work full-time on the chapel as long as their work was covered by other men. And that was, everyone stepped forward to help, so that wasn't an issue at all.
So from the starting point to the completion, how long did it take to build the chapel?
They moved the 2 Nissen huts towards the end of the November of 43, and they started on converting the chancel. The original idea was just to make one end into the chapel and have the other end as a school for the men. So they started off on just one end of the building. But as that progressed and the beauty of it became so apparent, they then decided to convert the rest of it into a nave. And then from that point, they then decided they would build a beautiful facade to hide the rather ugly entrance of the Nissen hut. So it was in stages, and it was during the summer of 1944 that the chapel, you could say in a sense, it was finished by the sort of late summer. And the men actually left on the 9th of September that year, so it was only in use for quite a short while. But even when it was just a Nissen hut with not much in it, the concept of building the chapel, it just gave the men hope where they were despairing before. And even Major Buckland makes a comment of this, that you could see the welfare of the men had been improved just by the fact that they knew they were going to build it even before it was created.
And then the war finished, and POWs went home, and life apparently returned to normal. But there's this lovely historic postscript about some of the characters involved in this story. I mean, did Domenico Chiocchetti, the artist, and Padre Giacomo went back to their lives in Italy, but they remained drawn back to Orkney because of the lasting legacy of the chapel, didn't they?
There's a tremendous story where the men were moved from the camp in Lamham down to Skipton in Yorkshire, and while they were there, Domenico became friendly with a local couple called Mr. and Mrs. Harvey. And years later, when the chapel had fallen into a fair state of disrepair, and the local Orkney people got the BBC interested, and the BBC actually broadcast a programme saying, does anyone know of the details of the artists, in particular the artist who painted the beautiful Madonna and Child above the altar. And Mr. and Mrs. Harvey in Yorkshire were the only people in Britain who had Domenico Chiacchetti's address.
Wow.
And so they heard the programme. I mean, if they hadn't heard the programme, he would never have been tracked down, I suspect. And so they contacted the BBC, and the BBC contacted the town hall in Moena in the Dolomites. And of course, no one had a telephone in their home in those days. And so it was arranged with Chiocchetti. He was given a message that he had to go to the town hall on this particular day to take a telephone call from the BBC in England because they wanted to talk to him about this his beautiful painting.
Incredible.
I mean, there are so many stories within stories connected to the chapel that many times you would think it should never have existed, it should never have survived the way that it has done. It's defied so many things.
And what was the ultimate fate of Domenico Chiocchetti and Padre Giacomo? What happened to them?
Well, Domenico came back to Orkney in 1960. The BBC actually paid for him to come back for 3 weeks and oversee restoration work, which was badly needed. And he then came back twice more in the following years. Ill health prevented him from coming back any more than that. And he was nearly 89 when he died. He remained in his village in Moena. Padre Giacomo, like all the Italians, was repatriated in 1946, and he went back into the monasteries that he had been in and lived his life in various monasteries during that time.
Philip, the chapel has been restored at least twice, I think. What percentage of similarity or authenticity does the current chapel bear to its original?
It's very authentic. The repairs that have been carried out have been done very sensitively, and they've only been done to essentially repair damaged plasterwork and that sort of thing. But what they have been able to do was peel off the painted paper and put that to one side and replace the plaster board, and then reposition the painted parts of the surface, if you like, so that really is very, very much the original work. And when you go in, it's not a pristine building. It is a beautiful building, but you can see that it has had some wear in it, where things have just been left. But
I was really touched by a story in your book which describes one of these random circumstances in which men are thrown together, involving Herbert Herman, who had been a mechanic on the U-boat that torpedoed the Royal Oak, Taffy Davis, who was on the Royal Oak and survived, and a local man in Orkney called Alfred Flett, who, for want of a better phrase, was part of a home guard or something. What brought these three men together?
This was an extraordinary story. The German U-boat U-47, which sank the Royal Oak, it went back to Germany in a hero's welcome. But after that, some of the men on board went to other U-boats, and one of those was captured within British seas, and one of those men had been on U-47, and that was Herbert Herman, and he was then in a prisoner of war camp in England. He met a local woman, and after the war they got married, and he stayed in England, or in Scotland actually, for the rest of his life. And he actually attended some of the memorial ceremonies for the sinking of the Royal Oak many years later, and he got to know some of the men who had survived, and he became friends with a few of them, and one of them was Taffy Davis, and they ended up one day sitting in a hotel bar in Orkney when Alfie Flett walked in, and he got talking to them, and he realised the significance of these two men together, because his father had been a warden during the war, and he had been within minutes of spotting U-47 slipping through the Kirk Sound and entering Scapa Flow, and he missed it. It was just fate. He missed it just by a few moments. What the outcome might have been, I don't know. If he'd seen it, he would have raised the alarm.
Yeah, but here we were 50 years later,
yes,
with these three men
together,
sitting round a cafe table.
Yeah.
One had been on shore, seeing the U-boat silently glide beneath the water. One had been on the U-boat about to inflict the damage,
yes,
and one was on the Royal Oak and survived. It's absolutely astonishing.
Yes, and that's just so typical of the stories that surround the chapel. It just goes on and on. Albert Pizzi, whose father was a prisoner of war in Camp 60, made a comment to me that the chapel is a never-ending moving story, and he's right. It still goes on. Even to this day, I get contacted by people who have some sort of connection to the Italians who were in the camp, either trying to trace their ancestors, or it just goes on, and it's very, very moving, the whole stories that are connected to the chapel.